Hello, everyone, and welcome back to yet another edition of the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you, as always, by the GSMC Sports Podcast. My name, as always, is Christopher Shepard. Thank you guys, yet again, for tuning in to today's show. And we should have another well-rounded show of player profiles and prop bets for you. Happy Wednesday to you all. I hope this show gets you over the hump of hump day. And it should really be a show filled with intriguing options for everyone, whether you're a fantasy fan or someone who likes to bet. We begin with our first college football player profile of the day, and then we will continue to our prop bets. But before we get to any of our segments, I do want to remind you to like, follow, and subscribe to the show on the network. It is greatly appreciated by all concerned. We also do receive a ton of tips and donations, so if you do feel so inclined, please consider leaving them at the link gsmc.cloud. It is a huge support to both me and my fellow podcasters, and ultimately the network as a whole. You can also leave any questions, comments, or concerns about the show at the link, and they will be answered and addressed at the beginning of the next episode. Without further ado, let's jump right into our college football player profile. And I wanted to select a guy to start off today's show who's definitely going to be talked about a lot more heavily come fantasy college football draft time. But perhaps the start of last season, no one really knew who he was or what he could be. Mainly because, for the first time, what felt like a long time as well, the Alabama QB situation seemed to be up in the air. And Jalen Milroe had not cemented himself as the steady option. However, as the season progressed, he quickly improved on the things that make him special, and as a result, Alabama advanced to the CFP College Football Playoff, upsetting Georgia in the SEC Championship game, and coming down to a fourth down goal line stand from Michigan away from reaching the actual championship game. That just shows the testament and will of a player like Jalen Milroe to stick with it till the end in Nick Saban's final season and send him out with some modicum of success, even though it did not end up in championship success. Now is a new horizon for him, though. A new head coach in Jalen Milroe, a guy who everyone knows has the potential to create a fantastic offense, as he did at the University of Washington, and now he has new player personnel as well. Gone is Isaiah Bond from last year. One of his leading receivers is one of his go-to targets. Gone is Amari Niblack. Both of them are now on SEC rivals Texas. How will Jalen Milroe really break in these young receivers, and how will Jalen Milroe as well, most importantly, break in these young receivers? Without further ado, let us jump right into the fantasy college football player profile of Mr. Jalen Milroe. Like I said, Jalen Milroe had very specific traits that I believe weren't tapped into as early as people, or Alabama fans in particular, wanted to. Because of the fact that nobody really knew if Jalen Milroe could balance both his abilities as a dual-threat quarterback with the verticality that a lot of Alabama football has predicated itself around. Nobody really thought that Jalen Milroe would take the next step. However, throughout the season, like I said, he averaged 10 yards per attempt, finally getting some success throwing the football down the field with a 65% completion percentage. Throughout his campaign, he had 2,834 yards, 23 touchdowns, and 6 interceptions. Obviously, not at the lofty goals of 3,000 yards, but remember where he was. And for where it ended up, that's fantastic for him, and it shows a steady progression. His best performance in terms of fantasy, let's point this out, was against LSU. That's right. Obviously, the LSU defense isn't good, but it's still a top 15 team last year. And there's Jaden Daniels. So him almost outplaying and matching Jaden Daniels was very impressive. 48.3 fantasy points from 15 for 23 passing, 219 yards. Obviously not the best passing stats, but here's where he made his money. On 20 attempts, 155 rushing yards and 4 TDs. So that just goes to show that not only can Jalen Milroe become fearsome as a passer, He still has the ability to break down defenses with his legs. He's almost like a second running back. However, his worst game in terms of fantasy was that CFP semifinal against Michigan. Only 8.9 fantasy points, only 16 for 23 for 116 yards. And so you can see the downsides and upsides immediately for Jalen Milroe. Unlike any other quarterback in college football, in my humble opinion, in terms of the drastic duality of where he was and what he can become. And now, understanding that he's no longer under Nick Saban, maybe that caveat is more positive than people think, but I also think it can be a negative. Because being as to how he was Nick Saban's last quarterback, and how he was just becoming his next project, this big experiment, and Nick Saban hadn't really trusted right away. I think it's kind of dangerous to now suddenly believe that momentum can carry over with Kalen DeBoer. But let's not forget, Kalen DeBoer really helped Michael Penix Jr. evolve his own game. And now, Jalen Milroe isn't just another example of a guy who can really evolve as well. And so, if we take this full season as a small sample of what Jalen Milroe can become, a lot of people will say the sky's the limit for this kid, and a lot of people will be skeptical. I prefer to lay in the former camp, but there are ways where I can be swayed. For example, let's talk about Kalen DeBoer's influence in terms of the transfer portal, both positively and negatively. He was able to bring in Jeremy Bernard, who was with him last year, albeit in a very top-heavy wide receiver room, so he did not get a lot of playing time. But he still had a decent season for a Washington Husky wide receiver not named Odunze, McMillan, or Polk. Then you have guys like Kobe Prentice and Kendrick Law who haven't really broken out yet into Alabama's system. Kobe Prentice is still kind of a young guy. I believe this is his junior year. He did average in the teens in terms of yards per catch, but he only had 18 catches last year. That's the caveat. Can you bring out the best traits in these wide receivers, but in bigger sample sizes? Can Kobe Prentice sustain that through a whole year? That's going to be the thing for Jalen Milroe and Kalen DeBoer as well. There has to be a connectivity between both quarterback and coach and both quarterback and wide receiver. Because Kalen DeBoer really is going to focus on getting Jalen Milroe to appreciate verticality more. I think that this Alabama offense is going to predicate itself on downfield throws. Because remember, Jalen Milroe really did impress people, most especially on his deep throws. But in the short to intermediate areas, that's where he struggled. And it's kind of a similar situation with what Michael Penix Jr. was dealing with. He was a fantastic deep thrower, but there are some areas in his short to intermediate game that just need to be improved upon and developed. And so, if Kalen DeBoer can reduce the amount of times that Jalen Milroe becomes especially concerned with getting the ball to a spot and just driving the ball downfield, then I believe that Jalen Milroe's dangerous traits really are on full display here. Because as a dual threat quarterback, right, your main priority is understanding that your legs open up so much more space for your offense to operate. And so, if Jalen Milroe continue dominating in the running game, add a second dimension there, and also be able to exploit that and be able to get the ball deep downfield, then Alabama has a winning formula. But the caveat is that this team doesn't feel the same as last year's team because there's a Nick Saban-sized hole in it. Nick Saban had the special ability to rally a team in whatever situation. no matter who was at the QB position, no matter who was at any position at all, really. Nick Saban was able to bring out the best in them because he understood that college football isn't always about wins and losses. It's about playing with passion. It's about understanding your role, and it's about discipline first and foremost. If Kalen DeBoer can assume that role, not just becomes more Saban-like in his beliefs, but also be able to say that, hey, we lost a lot of production because Saban left, but it's a new start. It's a new horizon. Then Alabama and Jalen Milroe will have untapped potential for many years to come. But Nick Saban certainly set a precedent for whoever succeeded him. To show no signs of weakness, to understand the players that you have in your camp, and most importantly, to get the best out of them, even if they don't believe it. And so, Jalen Milroe is the perfect archetype for what Nick Saban wants out of a player. Kalen DeBoer also has to realize that as well. He can't just say to Jalen Milroe, okay, here's how we're going to do this offense. We're going to just have you sling the ball all the time. No. Because Jalen Milroe is a very balanced player. And that's why I love him in fantasy as well. When we talk about dual threat ability in college football, there are very few like Jalen Milroe. He just needs to believe in himself, and he just needs to trust that Kalen DeBoer is the right guy to continue him on the path that Nick Saban set forth for him. So that should just about do it for this segment. Coming up next on today's show, we look at the prop bets for perhaps the easiest team to bet on in the NFL. You definitely don't want to miss that segment right after the break.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign.